Hello, good afternoon, happy Saturday. Thank you very much for stopping by. This is my third book review in my book review series. My name is Alex, and let's get started. So this book review is on The Boy Crisis by Dr. Warren Farrell and Dr. John Gray. And so, welcome. The Boy Crisis came out last year in 2019, and for me, it was highly anticipated. This also means the material itself is rather fresh. I've been following Dr. Farrell's work for the past couple of years now or so, and at the time of learning about the development of this book, I was thrilled. I first learned about his work through listening to Dr. Jordan Peterson's work. I believe Dr. Farrell's work came up through YouTube's recommended videos algorithm. I was drawn to the work because there was very little talk about men's issues in this postmodern world. Dr. Farrell's work resonated with me in the sense that he is another figure that is strongly supported and advocated for women and women's issues back in the day, but that when it came time to support men and men's issues, suddenly there wasn't the same level of support around. There was little funding for research, little patience or opportunities to speak about it in the mainstream. I watched and listened to many of Dr. Farrell's videos, lectures, and interviews. As soon as I was able to, I immediately purchased this book and I read it during my lunch breaks at work and at home. I'm someone who reads multiple books at once, and I select the material to read based on my mood and level of attention, quite frankly. Over the time of several months, as I read this book in intermittent bouts of reading sessions, I finished most of it last fall, but then about 2 weeks ago, I finished it entirely, having realized I only had a few pages left. Now that I've been doing book reviews, I decided this one would be next. So let's get right into it. Let's do a little book breakdown. So the book is divided into 6 parts, not including the introduction or conclusion. Part 1 right away acknowledges the sentiment and questioning the validity of such things as a boy crisis. It's called, Is There Really a Boy Crisis? It's a great intro, in addition to the introduction, which also has subchapters that investigates mental, physical, economic, educational, and worldwide crises. The final subchapter in the first part wraps it up by answering the question, why? Why are we so blind to the boy crisis? Here are a couple of key elements that I found especially informative in no particular order. The introduction establishes a fundamental aspect of this book and the social consequences involved. Quote, boys are declining in a dramatic way in virtually every key metric. And this worldwide decline among our sons will also hurt our daughters, their marriages, and their children's emotional and global security. That last part cannot be understated. The authors point out that this is a dark phenomena with boys in all developed nations. Secondly, the intro points out a terrible war between the sexes that results in neither one winning, per se. The authors write in bold that whenever only one sex wins, both sexes lose. Men and women, quote, men and women may be from different planets, but we're all rowing the same family boat. I think this part is especially relevant in today's times. I say this because as a person that's been in the dating field, there's a disturbing dissension between the sexes and superiority to the point where some men have given up on dating, while many women, it seems, flaunt their successes, trying in vain to show that they can do it too. But then they find that such a level and type of success does not necessarily equal the kind of happiness that they may be looking for when they're not even aware of it. The results of all this bickering and hating on each other has led us to the point of considerable misery for both sexes. Unless you leave your pride at the door and work towards something substantial instead, something more meaningful, because I believe many people are finding out that the promises of technology and modernity have been nothing but lies and false hopes. But I digress. Getting back to the point, this book essentially, as I quote, takes this multi-generational view as we look at our heritage of heroic intelligence and see how it affects our sons' and grandsons' health intelligence. The first part right away gets into it. It talks about murder, suicide, and race. Quote, Hispanics and Asian Americans commit suicide at about 1/3 the rate of whites, about the same rate as the African American population. African American males, by contrast, stick with murder and being murdered. Thus, while only 6% of the overall population, black males make up 43% of murder victims. More black boys between 10 and 20 are killed by homicide than by the next 9 leading causes of death combined. I want to point out a quick note here that especially resonated with me. It has to do with the Great Depression and how guys were jumping off of buildings. Quote, worth less, men considered themselves worthless, end quote. This is a sentiment that I think many men battle with and lose to things like drug use and suicide. It's important that this book talks about the disparity in finance dynamics when it comes to the sexes. Listen to this. Quote, if your son plans to live in an urban area, he'll likely live in one of the 147 U.S. cities in which young women under 30 haven't just caught up to their male peers, but now outran them by an average of 8%. In only 3 cities do young men earn as much or more. And single women are now buying their own homes at 2.5 times the rate of single men, end quote. As another example of how relevant this book is today and with today's job market, certain things remain constant and perhaps obvious, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be overlooked. This is going to come to a shock to no one that, quote, if your son is a heterosexual, then he discovers the harder it is to find a job, the harder it is to find a woman, especially if that woman has children or wants them. If your son is unemployed, a future mom may assume he'll just be one more child that needs support. This makes complete sense, right? Well, we live in a world where a basic understanding of these things isn't always clearly articulated, or perhaps it's purposefully obfuscated. Let's move along. Part 3 of the book, The Purpose Void. This part of the book goes over different elements to consider when it comes to the absence of purpose. I believe this is an especially important part of men and boys because purpose is everything. And we live in a time and world where finding that purpose can be tricky. While the chapters here outline some important things, modernity's role in all of this shouldn't be overlooked either. Once again, we have it so good in our country that there's this oppression narrative still, despite living in considerably improved socioeconomical and technological advances. This tells me that despite the boldness of modernity and its promises, it's really more of an illusion or outright deceit. Just because we're able to live convenient lives where we can enjoy options, including vices, rather freely and to consume as much of it as we want doesn't necessarily equal happiness. And I think that's what a lot of people are finding out more and more the hard way. Part 4, dad-deprived boys versus dad-enriched boys. This part of the book is where we learn another key concept. It's that boys who hurt us. I love that quote by Dr. Farrell. I thought this part of the book was also exceedingly relevant, especially during our current times. And especially telling detail of this would be to look at consequences of such. The concept of broken homes. Absence of a strong father figure in young boys' lives is especially damaging to their neurosocial intrapersonal developments that doesn't just go away. They're almost like scars that can either heal or worsen and or become like a sort of weight bringing him down. Quote, dad-enriched boys tend to fill the purpose void with constructive new senses of purpose. Dad-deprived boys are more likely to either drown in their purpose void or fill it with destructive sense of purpose. Does this sound familiar? Let's recap. Let's review what they had to say about dad deprivation in terms of societal costs. Quote, scholars calculate that every 1% reduction in family fragmentation would save taxpayers $1.1 billion per year. For example, as we'll see, dad deprivation increases the likelihood of teenage motherhood, and 80% of unmarried teen mothers become welfare recipients, costing more than $9 billion in tax dollars per year. I believe, numbers aside, that the whole bit on the term family fragmentation is especially important. I believe that the foundation of healthy and stable society starts at home, with the family, despite what modernity espouses. The writers are smart in pointing out that, while I paraphrase, that there are millions of boys who are raised in homes without their biological fathers, whether homes with single moms, same-sex female parents, or stepdads, prosper in large part because of the devotion, love, and wisdom of their non-traditional parents. So that's great too. Consider then what happens when you have a purpose void in the postmodern era, engage in all the vices, what's to stop you really, coupled with being raised without a father figure. You end up with social consequences not limited to the boy or man, but rather being that much more susceptible to being seduced into a destructive sense of purpose to identify it with. Suddenly now you have this identity, you join this cause, and you go out and destroy things because it's easy to do that. It's easy to be this iconoclast and take part into something you don't fully understand. But what's perhaps most insidious about this notion is that you end up being used like a puppet in some old child's tale. A puppet that becomes a jackass for a bit. But I digress. That's a whole nother story, but a classic one we've all heard of. Unless you were raised by wolves. The authors also note how dad deprivation is the main hole in the heart common to boys vulnerable to gangs and to boys targeted by sexual predators. Chapter 14 is awesome. It reviews why dads are so important. It refers to Appendix B, some 70 ways that children benefit from significant father involvement. While they're all entirely noteworthy, here are a few in particular that resonated with me. 1. School achievement. Study of boys from similar backgrounds revealed that by the 3rd grade, the boys whose fathers were present scored higher on every achievement test and received higher grades. 2, school dropouts. The more years children spend with no or minimal father involvement, the fewer years of school they complete. 71% of high school dropouts have minimal or no father involvement. Dad-deprived children are more likely to skip school or be kicked out, expelled. Employment. While boys from 2-parent homes are more likely than their sisters to be employed as young adults, boys who are dad-deprived are more likely than their sisters to be unemployed. And when they are employed, dad-deprived boys are also less likely than their sisters to succeed as professionals. Suicide. Living in a home without a dad is more highly correlated with suicide among children and teenagers than any other factor. Let that sink in. Drugs. Father involvement is at least 5 times more important in preventing drug use than closeness to parental rules, parental trust, or strictness, and is a stronger determining factor than the child's gender, ethnicity, or social class. One more. Violent crime. Every 1% increase in fatherlessness in the neighborhood predicts a 3% increase in adolescent violence. Chapter 15 is called Rediscovering Dad. Listen to this. Quote, more recently, leading researchers from Princeton and University of California, Berkeley teamed up to dissect the most sophisticated designs to determine whether the negative outcomes of children without dads was caused by father absence or by other causes such as poverty. They confirmed that father absence is not just correlated with negative outcomes, but actually causes negative outcomes. So that's rather interesting to digest. Here we start going into a deep dive into dynamics that once again prove relevant during our times. Has anyone ever heard of the Moynihan Report? The writers tell you about it, as it was directed by sociologist Daniel Moynihan, who also served under Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. The Moynihan Report concluded that in a majority Black community, the main predictor of growing up poor was not race, but being born to parents who are not married. Why? A predictable outcome of no marriage was no father involvement. So that's kind of a big deal, especially in today's times. There's so much inundated rhetoric that race is the single biggest factor in so much of its narrative as the absolute leading cause for so much social distortion. But when there's bits of information like that say otherwise, it's both refreshing and not shocking. Once again, I believe this has to do with the lies of modernity by promoting non-traditional lifestyles instead of healthy marriages that promote healthy, stable families. There are going to be consequences to that. And I believe we're seeing lots of that social unrest manifest from fragmented families. Let's keep moving on. Chapter 16 is packed with information. It's called What Dads Do Differently. It starts with outlining how, quote, moms are more likely to set boundaries where dads are more likely to enforce boundaries. This second part is key to an essential piece of the puzzle. Quote, boys with poorly enforced boundaries also become boys with poor impulse control, end quote. So that is just everything. Impulse control is absolutely key in keeping cool while living in times where it capitalizes on lack of impulse control from things like diet to lifestyle choices, good or bad. All these different things are indeed different, but there are salient connections about them that paint this picture of problems we see in society that end up manifesting in destructive forms. I believe another key component to this is the notion of postponed gratification. Another key point to mention here is the fundamental value of rough and tumble play, which I think is absolutely necessary to a healthy boy's development. Early in the book, the authors note that how exercise helps build the muscle of a child's brain even more effective than studying. That's another quote. It also outlines a few things to work together synergistically to promote the healthy development of a boy with a strong father figure that is the roughhousing and coaching. It helps build confidence within him as he engages with his peers. Invariably, boys will be boys, and part of that includes male-on-male teasing. Quote, the trading of wig-covered put-downs is boys and men's training each other to handle criticism, unconsciously knowing that the ability to handle criticism is a prerequisite to success. This is important because you don't want aggression to fuel within the boy, which, as the authors write, is evidence of being out of control, defensive, and unable to handle criticism. By coaching, it has to do with building up resilience within him in the sense that the father encourages his child to get up and try again when something goes wrong. Chapter 19. Chapter 19 is called Discrimination Against Dads is Illuminating. Chapter 19 is called Discrimination Against Dads, that it is illuminating. The authors write, quote, the feminist movement, initially supportive of the father involvement, began opposing equal rights for dads of divorce in the early 1970s. In the first year or two that I was on board of NOW, in NYC, so 73, Gloria Steinem used to tell me, what the world needs is more women at work and more dads at home. I beg to differ in this notion. And this is exactly the type of corrosive rhetoric that would poison the idea of the nuclear family. And furthermore, I believe we're seeing some of the results of those consequences manifest in many women's lives when they land that job, work, and make all this money and travel, yet remain unhappy. That this feminist propaganda deceived them and used them just like they use the men that choose to sleep with them but never propagate with. The result is indeed a lot of unhappy and unsatisfied people who bought into the lies of modernity. Chapter 24, Emotional Intelligence and Mental Health, has some great insight into some subtle but important dynamics when it comes to what the authors call a boy's compassion void. Here are a couple key things, and I'm going to read directly from the book, and this is actually on page 261. To whom can a boy express his feelings without either losing status among his peers or getting advice that he feels is often accompanied by a loss in respect? Often no one. His best chance for empathy is from his mom. How is it that a mom can hear her son express fears, but his potential girlfriend cannot? Because when a potential girlfriend hears a guy complain, it violates her instincts to be protected. But when a mom hears her son complain, it triggers her instincts to protect. With his dad, it's a little different. His dad is likely to emphatically protect him until he reaches an age where dad expects him to start acting like a man. And then, even though dad's heart may empathize, he fears that too much empathy will decrease his son's ability to be tough enough to be respected and loved. So all these things matter, right? Respect, love, masculinity, femininity, all of these things matter, and they're all related. New research reveals that a parent's compassionate listening positively affects the development of an adolescent's brain in a way that affects the rest of his or her life. When 12-year-olds with argumentative and angry moms were compared at age 16 to those with moms who were warm, affectionate, and approving in the face of disagreements, the 16-year-olds with the affectionate moms showed changes in the amygdala and prefrontal cortex that predicted less sadness and anxiety, plus more self-control. So, I don't necessarily believe in self-esteem anymore the way I used to. I think that was another lie. Rather, instead of using things like that kind of term, I would rather use things like having things like low confidence, for example. But not, I believe this notion of esteem and self-esteem was and is superfluous. And I think it's done more harm than good, especially when it comes to my generation, that is the millennials. The last chapter I'll briefly talk about is chapter 31, Natural Solutions to Restore Dopamine Function. This is because it discusses often overlooked things that can impact behavior, and that is diet, particularly a subchapter on improving gut health and digestion with probiotics. Here you learn about the microbiome, gut-brain axis, and it is important. So important that personally, I've had to make some changes in my diet to help promote better function and improve several aspects of my life, which I believe has. Putting it simply, I feel and think better with the less processed foods I eat. I bet there's plenty of us that won't find that shocking, yet there's plenty of us that eat lots of things like fast food routinely, and then wonder how eating such a diet could in fact be limiting you unwittingly in more ways than one. For my conclusion, I'm going to go ahead and say that The Boy Crisis was a wonderful read, insightful, and enlightening. It's very detailed, very thorough in its approach. It has plans for how to go about things to promote healthy families and strategies to build upon family dynamics in relation to both sexes, although clearly there's more of a focus on boys here. I hope this book review was helpful in case you've never heard of this book, or as another informational tool to gain a better understanding of some of these male-centered dynamics and issues. Lots of men may feel confused or even shamed just for being masculine, and I don't think that's healthy. And then we end up questioning why a lot of our problems in society are exactly that. They seem to stem from basic things that lead to other things that are unhealthy. We're constantly bombarded by propaganda like the future is female and depictions of the heterosexual male family figure being outdated and aloof or even just stupid. But I urge you not to be deceived. In an age where chaos is promoted, find strength in books like this to help clear out the web of lies by learning and educating yourself. It's not about men versus women. That's a narrative and a lie meant to perpetuate chaos. Remember one of the biggest takeaways from this book, instead, that when only one sex wins, both sexes lose. Thank you. If you like this video, please let me know in the comments. Let me know about the audio quality, right? And hit that like button. Subscribe if you wish to follow more of my work. And if you're especially generous, consider donating to my work as well. Thanks again for your time, and I hope you guys have a good rest of your weekend.